Peter's going to give a seminar today, and it's a real great pleasure to have him. For the hybrid purposes, we ask those who are on virtually to use the hand raising function. That'll, if you have a question, and that'll be the easiest way to monitor traffic, and we'll try to, and you can also chat as well. And take it away, Peter.
All right, Shane, thank you so much. It's great to be here at HBS to present this paper. This is a very familiar spot for me, having been a grad student at Harvard many moons ago, and it's great to see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. Andy, who was my office mate in grad school, and Chiara, who has been giving us some great comments at the end on this paper. So before I get started, I'd like to give you just a preview of my research agenda, and to situate that within the context of the research group that I lead here at Harvard. So we are a group of applied microeconomists who study questions at the intersection of education, labor economics, and public economics. And this is just a trailer of some of our work. So we have a paper on skills, degrees, and labor market inequality. And the headline there is really rethinking the way that we view workers without college degrees. Instead of thinking of them as being unskilled, we think about them as being skilled for alternative rights. And when we measure their skills based on their past work experience, what we find is that there's a huge untapped well of workers who are skilled in the US economy. And that work has gone on to be very influential in terms of how the leaders of the 110 initiative have gone about thinking about hiring 1 million Black workers in the next 10 years. And so a lot of our work really is about looking at the connections between education markets and labor markets. We also have work looking at why is it that elite colleges like Harvard have not expanded in the past 3 decades, and then work looking at why is it that the gender wage convergence stagnated during the 1990s. So this is like the trailer before the movie, and now we're going on to the movie. So welcome, lights up. The title of today's talk is Occupational Licensing in the Digital Economy. And there's no better place to be presenting this than here at HBS to this particular group too. And so I'm super excited about that. This work is joint with my colleague, Misha Fisher, who is the chief economist at Home Advisor, and who's the chief economist at Angie. Misha, if you're on the line, you can say a quick hello to everybody.
Howdy, everybody. Great to be with you virtually.
Awesome. And so feel free, folks, to ask questions throughout. Feel free to post questions in the chat. Misha will be able to respond to questions in the chat. If you come off mute, I can respond to those questions. And Misha, feel free to jump in at any point if you want to add something to what I've said. So this is joint work with Misha. Let's kick off with some background and some motivation. Whereas most of you are going to be familiar with the digital labor market, you might be less familiar with occupational licensing. And so I'm going to start off by first defining what an occupational license is. Before I do that, here's a picture of an occupational license from a plumber in the great state of Massachusetts. And so you can see we have Vincent Levine. He needs this particular documentation in order to legally work for pay as a plumber in the state of Massachusetts, because plumbing as an occupation is licensed in Massachusetts. And this is exactly what the definition of licensing is according to the BLS. It's a labor market credential issued by a government agency that allows you to legally work for pay. Without a license, you're working illegally and you can be fined, or you can face some other kinds of consequences. Licensing often also comes with some additional requirements. It could be that you're required to pass the test, get more education, or you might have to have a clean criminal record. And my other co-author, Bobby, and I have done some work looking at licensing as a signal of non-felony status and its implications on the racial wage gap. Now, you might say, I've not heard that much about licensing. Peter, why are you studying licensing? Funny story, when I started this work in the field of licensing about 6 years ago, I had a very senior economist say to me, Peter, why are you working on licensing? This is a dead field. We know everything we needed to know from Milton Friedman. Licensing restricts supply, increases prices, doesn't improve quality, end of story. But it turns out that licensing has really been atop the domestic policy agenda across successive presidencies, from the Obama administration to the Trump administration to the current Biden administration. And I had the opportunity while working on the Council of Economic Advisors during the Biden-Harris transition to really see the importance of thinking about labor market dynamism and the extent to which occupational licensing could be hindering labor market dynamism. Chiara has some really terrific work, like looking at the implications of licensing on customer satisfaction. And so I highly recommend anybody that's interested in this topic to also read Chiara's paper. There is extensive literature on licensing in offline markets. So going back to Adam Smith, to Milton Friedman, Morris Kleiner has basically like written the modern literature on this. And it's a quantity restriction that's going to reduce supply and that's going to increase wages. And this is something that's been established really well in the literature. There's less evidence that licensing leads to better quality of service provision. There's some exceptions. So for example, there's a paper in the JPE by Anderson et al. That looks at midwives, where they show that when midwifery was licensed, that you saw improved maternal health outcomes for kids. Licensing restricts interstate mobility. And there's also differential impacts by workers who might be minorities or might be racial minorities or gender minorities. Now, while we have this really large and growing literature, there's comparatively less that's known about the impact of occupational licensing, which is a labor market restriction that for the most part developed for the analog economy, like going back to the early 1900s on digital markets, right? And this relates to kind of this broader question of, as the economy modernizes, if it's still going to be regulated by legislation that was created when the economy was structurally very different, could you have some legislative overhang that in a sense can work against some of the efficiency gains that technology could produce? Now, there's comparatively fewer papers written at the intersection of licensing and the digital economy. I know of two. One of the authors is here in this room, Kiara and her co-authors. They have a very nice paper that looks at the home services industry, which we'll be looking at as well. And there's also a paper on Uber by Jonathan Hall and co-authors. He is the chief economist at Uber. And so we're gonna help to provide some additional insights to this growing literature, very important literature. Our research question is the following: what is the impact of occupational licensing restrictions on market clearing in the digital economy? And so we're going to be focused a lot on the extent to which a customer who's searching on a digital platform is able to find a worker to potentially do the work that they're looking for. And so we're really going to focus a lot on the search market. There are some terrific papers like Kiara's and others that have looked at what happens once you have a match between a worker and a customer on whether the customer values that person being licensed or not. We're going to be looking a bit further up the sales funnel in terms of saying how likely are you to match to a service provider even before you get to the point where you can negotiate. So this is going to be the focus of our context. I want to orient you on this figure here, which shows you the relationship between occupational licensing, the fraction of workers covered by it over time. So that's going to be the series that's in red. And the fraction of workers covered by unionization, which is the series in yellow. So we know a ton about unionization. I mean, like there are literally like thousands of papers written by economists about unionization. But unionization as a share of the economy has been falling from about 30% in the 1950s to about a little over 10% in nowadays, right? And we're thinking about unions right now at Harvard with the graduate students unionizing. By contrast, licensing has been increasing in its importance and its significance over time. But we know comparatively less about licensing compared to unionization. And we know even less about licensing and its impact in digital labor markets, right? And this is very topical. You look at what's happening with Prop 22 in California, with Uber and Lyft, and we really have to start thinking about how these analog labor market regulations are going to be impacting the digital labor market. The second thing to keep in mind too is the amount of transactions, the amount of workers who are receiving some form of payment from digital labor platforms has increased by almost fivefold in the past like 10 years, right? Although the base numbers look pretty low, right? It's only between like 1 to 2% of total transactions. And this is from data from JP Morgan Chase. This growth rate has been pretty steep over the past couple of years. And with the pandemic, this is expected to even accelerate more. And so we need to know about occupational licensing because it, as a labor market institution itself, is very important. But then also, the digital labor market is increasing almost exponentially. So we need to know about what's happening in the intersection of these two really important phenomena. Let me stop here before I go to talking about the research context. Are there any questions either in the room or online? And feel free to interrupt at any time. Shane,
yeah, I'll jump in with a question, Peter. Ram here.
Please.
So the trends are going up. Why why do we think licensing operates any differently digitally? Like, what's different in the digital labor market realm that interacts with occupational licensing where we sort of expect our theories to change, right? So, like, I agree they're both super important topics, right? But, you know, we could add in a bunch of other important topics with things going up and to the right. And it's unclear that I'm just trying to work out like what the sort of model or like background of like why the intersection of these two. I'm thinking you're going to get there, but I'm struggling with that a little bit right now.
Yeah, so I think the first piece is, you know, when I came to this work on licensing, we want to reform licensing. So that's clear from the earlier slide that I showed. And so whenever you want to reform something, I think it's important to understand, well, what is this thing doing? And so even before we get to this question of should we expect licensing to operate differently, it's a question of like, well, how is it operating? So that's an empirical question that we come to kind of very hands on the table. Intuitively, like one of the features of digital labor market platforms is they're supposed to facilitate match. Like that's one of the big efficiencies. And if we think that licensing is an analog economy, the question is, well, to what extent do we see similar impacts of licensing on digital labor market?
Hey, Peter, real quick, I think audio's been lost for the listeners online.
Okay, can you, all right.
It's cutting out, so maybe if there's a mic, stand closer to it, or if it's a lav, maybe switch to a wired one.
Yeah, no problem. Can you hear me okay? No? Nisha, can you hear me now?
It's still faint. It was great before Rem's question. Now it's he broke it. We can give him a hard time.
I apologize deeply for that. That was clearly me.
All right. Can you hear me better now?
That's excellent.
That's excellent. Okay, I'm going to take a step back. Can you still hear me?
Yep.
All right. So I think it's an empirical question. That's the first piece. The second component to it is a big part of digital labor platforms is to increase match efficiency. And we want to know to what extent does licensing potentially gum up this system, right? Because it could be the case that the technology is able to overcome any of the frictions that licensing would introduce, or it might be the case that technology is not able to overcome it. And this is an empirical question that's an open question, and we want to provide evidence on that. I want to talk a bit about the research context, which is the market for home services. This is a really big market. So this market is estimated to be around about like $500 billion in spending annually. And about 10 to 20% of this market exists online. Homes are the most important asset class that households have. In addition to that, close to 6 million service professionals work in this sector. So this is probably as big as teaching as a profession, right? So this is a pretty big deal. Moreover, the home services industry provides opportunities for workers without college degrees to get access to middle-class jobs in the US too. So from a mobility standpoint, this is going to be really important. And this sector is going to cover a lot of tasks as well. So some of the things that you should have in mind should be things like painting, a bathroom remodel, new roofing, new kitchen cabinets, etc. So like all of us who have homes or even who are renters have interacted with something that's broken or missing. The folks that we're going to study today, they're the people that help fix your homes. What's going to be our research strategy? We're going to have proprietary data on real-time transactions for about 20 million transactions in the home services industry. And this is all going to be pre-pandemic for the most part. And our outcome of interest is going to be the likelihood that a customer who is on the platform searching for a service provider is able to match to that service provider. We're not going to focus on what happens after the match. There's a lot of excellent work, so PR and others have excellent work looking at what's the impact of licensing on prices after the matches occurred, on the quality after the matches occurred. We're going to focus a bit more upstream on what's the likelihood of the match itself and what's the likelihood of search on the platform in the presence of licensing. Our outcome of interest is going to be this match probability. And we're going to measure this a notion of market clearing by looking at, well, what fraction of customers who are searching for a service provider in a given task are able to find that person. What's going to be our key outcome of interest? We're going to employ two causal research designs. So the first is going to be a boundary discontinuity design, where we're going to leverage the fact that licensing happens at the state level, and we're going to focus in on counties that border states. So where the licensing regime is going to be plausibly exogenous in terms of that, but these counties are going to be in very similar local labor markets. And that's a research design that's been used in a lot of other contexts, for example, to look at the capitalization of school spending on outcomes. The second is we're going to employ a difference in differences strategy that's going to leverage the fact that during our time period, we are able to observe a specific occupation in a state that goes from being unlicensed to being licensed. And so we can compare before and after with other states in the presence of this policy. So we're going to have these two different methods. The last thing that we're going to do is we're going to do a survey of skilled trades folks to see like what are their saying. And we're going to think about the survey evidence as complementary to some of the causal evidence that we have in the paper. A preview of our key findings. So first, we're going to find that licensing is going to reduce the match rate on the platform by about 15 percentage points, or about 25%. So this is pretty large. The results that we find are going to be similar across these two different causal research designs, diff and diff, and the boundary discontinuity. We're going to find that there's no impact of licensing on customer search. And so what's happening is it's really not about search. It's more about licensing being a restriction on supply. And the last thing that we're going to find is that the reduction in the match rate due to licensing is going to be exacerbated in sparsely populated counties. So that's something that is very similar to Kiara, the paper that you and Zoe have looking at like, the relationship between match rates and density in general. We're going to show that the relationship between match rates and licensing is going to be further moderated through density. Okay. Some of our key contributions. So we're gonna have a large administrative data set, and in our context, the licensing is going to be verified by the platform, and so this is going to reduce measurement error. We're going to have variation in licensing at the task level, not just the occupation level, which is more traditional in this literature, and so we're going to get even finer estimates. We're going to have variation across space and time, so we're going to allow for two different ways of identifying the same impact, and we're going to show that we get very similar estimates. And then this is a pretty important market in terms of its market size and also in terms of the asset class that it's going to be maintaining. And then in terms of our contribution to prior knowledge, a lot of the work has focused on the impact of licensing for customers. Like, do customers care whether or not a service provider is licensed or not? And again, referencing Kiara's paper with her colleagues, they also, in addition to the causal research design that they have, they also show in a consumer survey that most customers don't even know if the person that came to fix their apparatus is licensed, right? So customers don't seem to care a lot about licensing. We're going to go further upstream and say, like, how is this affecting the likelihood that the customer is able to match to a service provider rather than looking at conditional matching? What is the impact of licensing on customer satisfaction? We're going to find that the negative labor supply effects of licensing in the online market are going to be remarkably similar to the estimates that we find from the offline labor market, just using survey data from the CBS, right? And so that's something that was a bit surprising to us. And also population density is going to matter a lot. And this seems like it's a theme across like multiple different papers that look at platforms, that the effectiveness of platforms in terms of performing its market functions is going to increase with the density of a place, right? So we need to think a lot about what are the distributional consequences of our economy becoming a lot more digital. Like, how much is that going to exacerbate existing inequalities across space?
So you're going to see match rates, but you won't see the prices.
That's right. We won't see. So the platforms vary in terms of like what you're able to see, and so like the comparative advantage of our particular context is that we're going to be able to see match rates like really well. We're not going to see prices as well. I think in Kiara's context, like we're going to be able to see prices like a lot better too. And so we really see these studies as being like very complementary, where we can understand what happens on the front end of the funnel in terms of like search and match. And then in their context, they can see what happens at the back end of the funnel, which is like conditional and match, how a price is determined and like to what extent does nature of competition change.
Sorry, let me add one thing. We also look at match in our paper, so we look at the entire funnel. The difference, I think, is that you find some effects on different margins from ours, because you see an effect on match rates, which we don't. And the interesting question from my perspective is trying to figure out why you find that margin, and maybe if you had other data that Jay was hinting at, you could see whether other margins also are affected or not.
So we should talk about that more when we get into the empirical design too. And I can show you what we see on search. So on the search margin, we see no impact on the search, but what we really see is a lot of the impact is going to be in terms of like whether service pros are like responding to the opportunities to have leads, or in context where there's licensing.
And then one follow-up is it's a local service platform. Is the platform a high fraction of a labor
Yes.
market or a tiny fraction of the, not just the online market, the total labor market? So if it's a small fraction of the total service market, then you would presume the wages are, you're passive as a provider. You take the prevailing wage. If on the other hand, they're a larger fraction of the service market, it might move wages depending on the match here. So that's partially another question that perhaps you can speak to.
Yeah, so you're thinking about like if the licensing itself is affecting the prevailing wage within the local labor market, then that can be that could be impacting. That's something that we can think a bit more about.
Well, there's already research that shows from the offline economy that shows that occupational licensing does increase the wages.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
If you can sort of look at the entire occupational licensing literature altogether, there is that effect on prices. To what extent these people are going to be affected by those wages, who knows? I don't.
Yeah.
So we're going to describe now the search and matching on the platform. So the way to think about it is a service provider comes, for example, I want to get my house cleaned, or I want to get my house repaired. I open up Home Advisor and I start to search on the platform. There are going to be some tasks that are going to be licensed and some tasks that are not licensed. Now, again, what's unique about this platform is it's really going to screen people beforehand to make sure that service providers have licenses for tasks that require licenses in that particular context. And this is going to be like a very, very like clean to measure licensing. And once the customer has decided to search, then service provider is either going to accept or not going to accept that offer. Now, the not accepts could be because the service provider doesn't want to purchase a lead. It could be that the service provider has his or her app turned off. It could be because of any number of reasons. And we're going to bundle all of that into like a not accept, right? Because at the end of the day, any kind of unmet search is going to be, something that we want to pick up within our context too, because we really want to focus on unmet search. I wanted to get my house cleaned, so I looked for house cleaning. After I did that, thankfully, I was able to find 3 matches. And what you can see here is that when I click on these matches, something that's really important is it says that Angie is going to require the service provider to hold applicable state and local licenses. You also see that here too, in terms of their screening processes here as well, that they verify the applicable state and local licenses, and this is beforehand. And so this is going to be a different source of variation than, for example, like here in your context, you have variation in like when the licensing verification is going to come through on the platform, and you can use that quasi-random variation to like identify like how much the customers value knowing whether or not their service provider is licensed. In this context, we're really going to be leveraging variation like across state and within state to get at what's the impact of the licensing regulation itself on match.
Can you tell a little bit more about how Angie verifies the licensing credential?
I can't. So Misha probably can speak a bit more closely to that. So Misha, do you want to?
Sure. Can you just repeat the question? It was in the audience, so it was a little faint.
Oh, sorry. Kiara asked a little bit about like how Angie verifies the licensing.
Oh, there's a team whose sort of full-time role is verifying the licenses with the state boards. So I'd have to check the exact details of how it's done. We take it as a given, but it's something that the platform touts on the website, and the team that handles it works, year round to keep things updated as it goes. And so it's both checking. There's 2 parts to it. There's A, checking that the pro has the license, and there's B, checking that the task requires the license. And so they go back and forth between those 2. Was that helpful?
There must be also a link to what category that license applies to.
And Peter, can you just repeat the question in the mic?
A link to which category it applies to?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, so all of that will be included, right, Misha? So like they will check with whatever the local licensing board is for those particular tasks, and then make sure that the person who is reporting a license actually has the license.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
So
so I think,
it's both those steps.
does that answer your question? So for example, we're going to be able to have, sorry. We're going to be able to precisely measure whether a specific task requires a license within a primary work category. So for example, in the context of Colorado, we have installing a water heater and clearing a clogged drain. Both of those are going to be plumbing functions, but installing the water heater is going to require the license, whereas the other function, clearing the clogged drain, is not going to require the license. So we're going to be able to really look at these work categories disaggregated even at the task level. And this is important when we think about a job now as a collection of tasks in this kind of like order and estimability framework.
So that's exactly where my question was, sort of like who decides that clearing a clogged drain doesn't require the license versus installing a water heater requires it? Because the licensing specifications are quite detailed at the state and occupation level.
So my understanding from what Nisha said and from some of our previous conversations is that the team that handles that will work directly with the specific boards to make sure that, like, here's a specific set of tasks, like, okay, which tasks are covered, which tasks are not covered too. And like the incentives are going to be aligned for both the state boards and then also for the legal team to be able to make sure that there's clarity from an enforcement standpoint of these regulations. And this is a pretty unique feature of the data, that this isn't just self-reports, but this is verified before we get on the platform. Okay, so let me come now to the empirical designs. So we're going to have 3 designs. The first is going to be, we're just going to look at a linear probability model, and then we're going to put in like time, state, and task effects to look at just what's the underlying correlations within the data. And then secondly, we're going to implement a boundary discontinuity design, where we're going to focus on those counties that are at the intersection of state boundaries and leverage the positive exogenous variation within a local living market in the licensing requirements at the state level. And the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to leverage the fact that in 2019, the state of New Jersey passed a regulation that licensed pool contractors. So we can do this kind of thing in the case study. And for this, we're going to be able to Shane's laughing. Of all things. I know, right? So what we do here now is present you with some summary statistics. In the top, you can see like the fraction of service. So I should also mention too that we take a 10% subsample of the 20 million data points just to make it manageable to run a lot of our analyses. So what you can see here in this first piece here is like the 10% random subsample, that about 40% of the jobs are in tasks that are licensed. The accept rate is about 56%. And then the average cost at the primary work category level is going to be around about $4,000. This is something that we get from like a small survey of the data, just to see like what people generally report as the cost of getting stuff done. But we don't have this at the individual kind of like transaction level, so that's why we're focusing a lot on that. Now, in the boundary sample, you can see that these things look pretty similar, right? And so they're kind of like 2 points. So the boundary discontinuity design is going to give us like a better identification strategy than just using the general OLS. But then looking at the fact that these 2 samples look very similar, there's going to be a great deal of internal validity. So that's the purpose of this. The second thing that we're going to do is we're going to use county level measures of housing supply attributes and also demographic characteristics of the counties to interact that with whether or not a specific task is licensed, to get at what are some of the distributional consequences of licensing. And so for that, what we report are disease scores in our data for these different attributes. And so what you can see is that whereas between the boundary sample and the 10% random subsample, they look pretty similar. So we have great internal validity. When you think about extrapolating our findings to the broader population, our sample is not going to be representative of the broader population. And so what we will do to kind of account for that is to show you what happens when we re-weight our observations so that the county counts in our population look a lot like the county counts in the stat. And the headline there is that the results are not going to change that much. And so you can really believe in the generalization of our estimates to the national population. So here we go with our empirical results. So first we start off with our linear probability model, where we look at what's the accept rate for request bar for a task T. T is not month, T is not time. M is in a given month, and S is in a given state. And we're going to regress the whether or not a dummy for whether or not a given request by a customer is accepted, on whether that task is licensed, that task T is licensed in that state. And then in our most demanding specification, we're going to have task fixed effects, we're going to have month fixed effects and state fixed effects. And the coefficient of interest is this data here, which is going to tell us by how many percentage points does the accept or the match rate change when that task is licensed versus not. The series of results that we're going to show you is going to consist of 4 different tables, and in each of the tables we're going to add more controls. So in this first column, we just run the models where we have no controls. The second column, we run the models where we have state and month fixed effects. And in the third column, we have state, month, and primary category fixed effects. And in the third column, we're going to include task fixed effects. And so we're really going to be looking at the same task in 2 different states, where the task is licensed in one state, but unlicensed in the other state too. Let me draw your attention to the results in column 4. What you can see is that licensing a task is going to reduce the match rate by about 12 percentage points. And that's going to be off of a base of about 16% for the accept rate. And so that's going to translate into a 12 percentage point reduction, or about a 21% reduction in the accept rate when it's licensed.
Variation in whether particular task is licensed. What's your sense of whether, for example, numbers in Massachusetts have to be licensed, but maybe to be law that might, have to be licensed. What's your sense of how many professionals actually enter the plumbing occupation for the unlicensed task?
So Bobby and I have a paper on this, where what we do is we look at we run an occupational choice model, and we can see whether or not a task is licensed or not. And what we find in that context, we use Untitled Design as well. And what we find is that licensing a task reduces kind of like the labor supply by about 20%. So we find that
At the task level.
This is that's at the occupation level.
So I'm curious about the task level right here, because if for the 90% of the tasks that a plumbers can take, that plumber needs to be licensed. My guess is that even for the tasks that don't require a license, you will see an effect.
I see what you're saying. So like
a reduction in the probability of being matched, because somebody will not just enter as a plumber to declog toilet.
Secondary effect.
Right? Yes.
I see. So you're thinking that, do you have people who are licensed doing tasks that are unlicensed?
Exactly.
And what's the impact of that on those specific?
Yeah, so you're using that variation here, right? But if there's no unlicensed plumbers in Massachusetts that declog your toilet, that task is effectively as if it were licensed.
So
Yeah.
So I mean, you can get some traction on that by looking at how the point estimates change, whether we're looking at the variation within the primary work category or at the task level. And so in some sense, like, you could think about this difference as kind of like bounding what that would be. So that would be around maybe like 2 percentage points at most, if you think that there's some kind of a spillover.
Yeah.
So that could be one way to get some traction on that. And that's one of the attractive features too, of like being able to see whether a specific task is licensed, right? Because a lot of that is coming from the fact that the platform has a dedicated team of legal folks who are seeing like, what is the actual way in which the regulation ought to apply, but in practice, like how people practice the application can be different. And by looking at the difference between these 2 columns, we can get a sense of like how much of that is.
A question about this sort of state effect. Actually, I need to take this out.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. So what I mentioned earlier was that the sample is going to be internally like valid across the full sample and the boundary samples, but then it's going to be unrepresentative for the national sample. And so what we do is we reweight things. We population reweight things so that our sample looks a lot more like the population. And these results are, again, for the linear probability model in our reweighted sample versus in the not reweighted sample. And what you can see is that the point estimates look pretty simple. I mean, they're virtually indistinguishable from each other.
Okay, now I can ask. Sorry about that. My luggage.
Totally
you know,
fine,
was
Jake.
left off the plane
Sure,
last
totally
night,
fine.
so
Go for it.
that was fine. They just delivered it to us. So, the state fixed effects matter a lot, right? So they change your estimate a lot. And I wonder whether that's symptomatic of differences in gray markets across locations. So in other words, in the places where there's a much more active avoidance, if you will, you're less likely to get an online match. And what the location is telling us, what the location fixed effect is telling us is customers go to the illegal market. Or is the geographic fixed effect telling us something very different?
Maybe you can think about the geographic fixed effect too, is like capturing like variation in intensity of the platform across space too. So I would think that that's the first order thing, right? So if you imagine that the coverage of the platform is heterogeneous across space, then like one of the things that you can see from the sum statistics is that like, so let's look at this for example, population density like is pretty skewed towards like dense places, skewed towards places with a lot of college and so on and so forth. And so I would think, I mean, like my hunch would be that the state fixed effects is capturing a lot of the kind of like local variation in the demographics and the housing supply characteristics. And I think that's probably, I think that's the main thing that is captured. And the other piece of evidence towards that is like when we reweight, we actually don't see any differences in the weighted and the unweighted results. And so that is suggesting that capturing like the state fixed effects is picking up a lot of that heterogeneity. So our next strategy, which is going to be our first causal strategy, is around just continuity design. And we've taken this blown-up version of the great state of Massachusetts. And so if you look at Rockingham County and Essex County, Rockingham is in New Hampshire, Essex is in Massachusetts. And for example, kitchen remodeling is going to be licensed in Massachusetts, but not in New Hampshire. And so you get this situation where you have like a similar local labor market, but in one context, there's going to be licensing here, but not licensing there. So we're going to zoom in and create these kinds of natural experiments around state borders to look at what's the difference in the match rate within a given task across these two different categories. And the classification is going to be an augmented version of the probability model. And so we're going to add in all of these boundaries and sequence here. And I've indicated those, we've indicated those by these like hashes to show you all of the different shared boundaries with this particular example. And again, we do the same kind of analysis. So Shane, to your point, notice that when we look at the boundary sample, where you're looking within a local labor market, the starting point estimate is much higher to begin with. And so to your earlier question, I think what the state fixed effects are going to be absorbing is a lot of the heterogeneity in the demographic characteristics of class. This is probably the smoking gun. That's how I think that's right? Because if you look back, yeah. Okay, awesome. And so when we go to our specification where we have both the state, the month, and the task fixed effects, what we find is that licensing is going to reduce the match rate by about 15 percentage points, or about 24%. Right? And it's even stronger when we look in this context where we think the causal identification is going to be but notwithstanding that, we see that we find very similar estimates to from the OLS, right? And so this is very similar to what you saw with like Raj Chetty's work with the Opportunity Atlas, where he has this mover design, which is kind of a causal design, but then he also has looking at the correlations in the data. That's kind of like when you have these data contexts, you can have a situation where you win like your OLS or like that's very similar to the causal estimates.
Question's almost more from Misha than from you, but
yeah,
you might be able to address this. So you can see individual customers, right? So if you're at the micro level, you can see who's ordered or looking for someone. So,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so can you see repetition of coming back? So in other words, it does probability of losing a match diminish willingness of somebody to come back to the platform later. So if you could do the estimate of probability of it being a repeat customer conditional on a match, would you be able to estimate in some sense an additional second order cost from licensing to the
but this time the cost goes to the platform because they don't get a customer.
That's an awesome question. Theoretically, yes, we can. Not in this data set that we've assembled, because that by default is PII, the identifiable information. So we have a strict firewall on that to comply with all the data restrictions that go along with that. But theoretically, one could sort of come up with like a longitudinal panel of requests.
One quick tack on to that is, so from my prior work with my former grad student Bobby Chung, what we find is that in the offline market, you see licensing reduces labor supply by about 20%. So imagine that person's like, look, I'm totally fed up. I can't find anything online. I go offline. We find that there's kind of a similar effect in the offline market too. And so that would suggest to us that like any kind of cascade is going to be amplified similarly. It genuinely is a lost customer. Yeah. Okay. What we do next is, so we've done the linear probability model, we've done the boundary suspension design, headlines so far, licensing reduces the match by about 15 percentage points or 24%. Now we have this unique case study in New Jersey where we can observe, and we pull a bit longer time series because in order to do the different strategy, we need like a before and after. Can you all still hear me for folks who are online? Okay, perfect. And we can run a different dip where we interact. We create dummies for like after the policy, interact with New Jersey, control for statement, and pass for fixed effects. And here's what we get. We run the same analysis, all of these different levels of controls. And again, to like in this context sheet, in this first column, you actually see like the effect of licensing is even more negative here, right? And so those fixed effects are really doing a lot of those fixed effects are really controlling the job. So the headline here is that licensing within this case study is going to reduce the match rate by about 10 percentage points, and that's off a base accept rate of about 42%. So in percentage terms, it's going to be about a 24% reduction. So we're seeing like a very similar reduction in terms of percent of the match rate when we have occupational licensing.
So you could say that you're doing swimmingly well.
Yeah. So in a former life, I was a physicist, and like for physicists, like you want to be able to show something in multiple different ways. And we're using like very different sets of variation. We're using like spatial variation, and then we're using spatial and temporal variation. And that's comforting. What we do to kind of drill down into the diff and diff is we say within this diff and diff, there are actually 50 kind of quasi experiments where we can compare New Jersey before and after with each of the other states in the world to see what are the impacts that we're going to have. And this is like a waterfall diagram that shows you this dashed line here is going to be the average, which is that minus 10%. This blue line is going to be the mode, which is basically the same as the average. And what we can show you is that 39 out of the 50 state-by-state comparisons have negative effects of licensing. So if you wanted to kind of create a p-value, imagine that each of these are independent experiments. You can say that this is like kind of like some binomial process where if it were point flip whether it would be plus or minus, you would get a p-value of us getting like these many negative values, like 0.000. To get at the typical confidence, like a 95% confidence, sorry, to have like a test that has like a size of like 5%, you would need to have at least 30 negative coefficients in this case.
I just can't say that your proof was a full.
Yeah. So what we do next is we look at heterogeneity. We look at heterogeneity by both demographic characteristics and by labor supply characteristics. So we can see from the census, population density, family income, rental prices, sharing rates, etc. In terms of housing supply, we can see both the quality and the quantity of the housing stock. And we standardize all of that relative to the national distribution in the census. And what we're going to do next,
Peter, before you go on, just two things for the online. Can you stand like 2 feet closer away from the screen? I know I want to see you pointing at the screen.
Sure.
The audio is just way better then. And then, I don't know what's going on there. Maybe this connects back to Shane's one. What's wrong with Maryland, DC, and all the stuff going on there was fascinating. In your last plot with the different diff estimates, the ones with positive were Maryland, DC, and Delaware. Right. So I just thought that was interesting because those are all near one another. Right. So I don't know if you have a theory there. The other one that I think is like a more substantive question is, do you have a sense of people going, like, the outcomes are all on the platform? And so maybe Shane, you mentioned this, but like, are people going then just outside the platform to do this matching, right? So I don't have to pay the Angie fee. I just go outside. I was wondering if you could use particular tasks that maybe there's more or less supply outside of the platform or that are more urgent or something, right? Because I know I've used these platforms before. It doesn't work out there, so I just call the plumber directly, right? And I get the plumber and they come out. And that's always a concern I have when people are looking at like Yelp or platforms like this, is that you're just learning something about the platform as against something about the larger market. It's nice that it's consistent, but I don't know, do you have any evidence that kind of speaks to that? I've been trying to work out ways to go. We lost all audio online.
Rem, you're unmuted too.
Can you hear me now, Anessa? I've just broken the entire seminar, so I'm going to be quiet and Peter can talk to me later today. I apologize for breaking everything.
That's fine.
It's always
It's
Rem.
always Rem, yeah.
It's always Rem.
Okay, here comes the good part.
All right.
So I have the speaker here. I don't know if that's gonna affect
Let me
Let's
move
have
that.
the speakers on his computer.
on his computer.
Setting up device, we're setting up the microphone.
Like, can we get rid of the iPad?
Yeah,
Because it's not recording, right?
it's not recording.
Okay, how's that?
All right. Can you all hear me okay? Perfect. Awesome. Okay. I think we are in business.
Can you have the
right,
volume
this is
change
good.
for us?
Can
Yeah, it's
can
on
somebody from the audience or from Zoom say something?
Rem, don't unmute yourself. Can you hear us?
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, don't worry. I'm pretty close to the end of the presentation, so if you're worried that I won't have enough time to finish, I promise you I will. So we do this heterogeneity. So, I wanted to say great suggestions. I made a note of those that we can look at the urgency of the task. Something that we've seen in our prior work is even in the offline market, you see licensing reducing the supply of available workers by about 20% too. And so we think like the consistency of this number, and something that I'm going to show you again too, which is that like the licensing isn't impacting the search margin, it's really impacting kind of like the supply margin on the platform. The fact that we see this in the offline market too suggests that it's not just, I'm going to go call my plumber from the yellow pages. So we think that's the best evidence, but we can do what you've suggested as well. All right. So what we've done here is we've interacted z-scores of these housing supply characteristics and also of these demographic characteristics of the counties to try to get at, are there distributional consequences of licensing? Do we see the negative impact of licensing on match rates more decidedly in certain contexts versus others? For this exercise, we focused on the boundary sample because in that context, we can use our more stringent identification strategy. And we've kept the sample consistent in a context where we have like no fixed effects, then when we add fixed effects, and then we add the boundary fixed effects in addition to the standard task, month, and state fixed effects. And the key finding is the following, is that the thing that matters the most is population density. So in places that are sparsely populated, you see that the negative impact of licensing on the match rate is going to be exacerbated. If you take this impact here, so 1 standard deviation increase or decrease in the population density is going to decrease the match rate by about 5 percentage points. What this suggests is that the only households that don't experience a negative impact of licensing on match rates are households in the top like 1% of the population density distribution. So there are huge distributional consequences, but like everybody is being negatively impacted in terms of their ability to have search on the platform in the presence of licensing too, right? And we think that that's pretty astounding. What we do next is we want to see like how much of this is that licensing is impacting customer search behavior versus licensing is impacting the provision of service by the actual service providers, or like whether they see the request and so on and so forth. So what we do is for each task at the month state level, we can aggregate the total number of requests, and we can aggregate the total number of accepts, and then run the log of the number of accepts on whether or not that task is licensed. And we can also license in that particular state. We can do the same thing for the number of accepts too, as a way of separating out the supply and the demand channel, which were otherwise kind of conjoined. And what you can see here is that this is the log request. So if a task is licensed, this has no impact on the request. It literally moves it by like 1%. It moves it by like 1%, that's it, right? 1 percentage point. Whereas if we look at log accepts, it reduces it by about 17%, right? 17 log points. And so all of the reduction in the match rate is coming on the supply side of the market and not on the demand side of the market. And this is consistent with the survey evidence in Kiara's paper that customers don't even know if someone's licensed or not, right? So we think this is very consistent with the previous literature. We did a survey of service providers on the platform to get a sense of what they think about occupational licensing. The survey also covered a lot of other things. I'm gonna pull out just one of the questions. I have some more in the backup slides if folks are interested, which has to do with what kind of effect do you think that simplifying licensing barriers would have on getting more people involved in the trades. And what you can see is that only 10% say no impact, right? The other 90% either say a major impact or modest impact on licensing. And so service providers are aware of the fact that licensing itself is a barrier to entry. And we have a question that focuses on that a little bit more. In the remaining 3 minutes, what I want to do is just walk us through the conclusion slide, and then I'll stop after that, and then we can continue to discuss over like lunch. And for folks who are online, I want to invite you to stick around for the post discussion as well, or to shoot me an email. So it's peter_blair@gsc.harvard.edu, or you can link me up on Twitter @pqblair. So in conclusion, we have several key findings. So the first is that licensing is going to reduce the likelihood of a match by 15 percentage points, or about 24%. This is going to be primarily, as you saw previously, through the supply channel and not through consumer demand. So customers aren't really sensitive to whether or not like a task is licensed or not. So just based on their search behavior, this is like revealed preference evidence that like licensing doesn't matter tremendously to customers. And the negative labor supply effects that we're going to see in our context, which is the online market, is going to be very similar to what we see in the offline market. And so what this suggests is that the technology itself is not helping us to overcome the friction that licensing is. And if anything, you can think about it as like the regulatory overhang from the way that we've treated the analog labor market is having the same negative impact in the digital labor market. And we think that that's a really important thing to wrestle with, not just in the context of licensing, but when we think about other sorts of like labor market regulations that apply equally to the digital labor market as they did to the analog labor market, right? And the welfare impact. So there's a paper by Morstein and co-authors that show that like the reduction in supply due to licensing can be a sufficient statistic for welfare. And so there are huge negative implications in terms of like welfare when you see like less tasks being attended to. This isn't just going to be people shifting to the offline economy, because even there we see some really negative impacts of licensing within that context too. And the person's house is an important asset for wealth, but it's not just an important asset for wealth, it's become an important asset for production during the pandemic as well too. And I just want to end with this funnel that summarizes our results. A customer comes in, about 1% of them are going to be impacted on the search margin by whether the task is licensed or not. But in terms of the match rate for tasks that don't have a license, that's going to be around about 60%. But when the task is licensed, that's going to drop to about 45%, right? And so you can see that this funnel is going to get narrower and narrower. And then you have at the end of this funnel too, when you zoom in on what happens conditional on a match, do you see impacts of licensing on that margin too? So I want to stop there. Thank you for your great questions and comments. If you have other suggestions, please feel free to stick around and ask those questions, or to give me those comments by email or by Twitter. Thank you so much for having me here.